I've been recommended this game on Twitter by some of you folks, which is where you can communicate with me, which turned out to be a really interesting game. The protagonist, a young college student, moves out of her parents' house after a dramatic fallout, causing her to struggle with life, having minimum wage jobs, barely affording an apartment, and being overwhelmed by stress. That's when a strange boy comes to the image, falling over his feet, eagerly trying to please the overwhelmed protagonist. Hello there, I'm R, your narrator. This video will have spoilers ahead. With that in mind, let's begin. The protagonist of the story is sitting alone on a bench in a park, away from running track, contemplating about her life and her decisions. She explains how the strain of stress caused by her parents' drama caused her to grow up fast, rushing into college, finding an apartment and a job to pay for her expenses. But reality is far crueler than one can anticipate. The sheer pressure at work in a diner is making the protagonist feel crippled, especially as it's minimum wage, making her barely make the ends meet. This forces her to find a roommate to afford her small apartment, which she had to find in a rush. As a consequence, it turns out that the roommate is a self-serving deadbeat who brings different college dropouts into the apartment frequently, without any prior discussion, making it unbearable living in there and impossible to sleep with the constant loud noises at night. Even worse, the roommate has been late on paying their share of rent, making the protagonist find a second job just to afford the rent. Being frustrated with her intense living situation, she closes her eyes, trying to forget all of her problems for at least a short while, focusing on the present and where she is. A secluded part of the park filled with the sounds of birds chirping and the stream flowing. The peace and quiet of getting away from people and starting to slowly unwind, things take a different turn when she feels someone sit next to her, interloping her space and ruining her moment of zen.
Whoa, hey, take it easy, it's just me.
Visibly startled, the stranger doesn't make it any more comfortable by saying such a bizarre thing, as if the protagonist knows her for a long time. The stranger, clearly not picking up any social cues, gets closer and closer to the protagonist, making her extremely uncomfortable, making this peaceful little escape a potentially dangerous situation. The awkward stranger carries on talking as if he's good friends with the protagonist, asking personal questions, making the protagonist more and more concerned. Just when she thought this encounter wouldn't get any more strange, the stranger suddenly asks the protagonist out on a date, which confuses the protagonist, asking reasonable questions to why the boy is so interested in her. Shocked to his delusional answer, the protagonist freezes in place, unsure to how follow up in this conversation. Although there's only one ending to day one, there are few ways that the protagonist can get there. Unsure to how to answer to such a bizarre assumption, the protagonist accepts the stranger's invitation for the dinner date. As of late, she has been overwhelmed by the amount of stress and loneliness. Surely a date would make her unwind a little and ease off her mind. The stranger, surprised to the outcome of this weird proposition and claim, takes the protagonist's hand, then quickly gets up and prepares to leave, when he suddenly stops and comes back, mentioning that he forgot to arrange a place to meet. The stranger then proposes to meet in the diner the girl works in, which he doesn't take much time to contemplate about and accepts. It's only when the boy gets up and leaps in each of his steps, seemingly very excited, when the protagonist asks herself to how he knew about the place she was working in. Concerned with the question, she decides to not overthink it and make the date at her workplace. After some time, waiting for this gleeful stranger who made her extremely flattered, she decides to order a milkshake to engage herself in an activity. The boy soon shows up, as if he's run a mile without taking any breaks, holding a long box. The boy sits across from the protagonist, having a wide smile on his face, gasping for air, when he slowly slides the box towards the protagonist. As she opens it, she witnesses well-prepared roses, which seem to have been purchased right before their meeting. The concerning question that developed earlier, nagging in her head, comes to mind, asking the stranger to how he knew about the place she was working in. The boy, without any hesitation and much thought, answers that he walks by the diner quite often and he constantly saw the protagonist working there. That's when he became attracted to her, but he never had the courage to go to the diner and ask her out. Feeling like a loser and addressing himself as one, the protagonist reassures him and asks him his name. The shy and timid stranger refrains from giving out his name, insisting that he doesn't like it, displaying whether he's hiding something or that he genuinely doesn't have any self-esteem. He lets the protagonist choose a name for him, which he likes no matter what it is. Their date develops deeper, with them holding each other's hands and staring at each other, appreciating the moment. Sharing the milkshake and enjoying the time together, the protagonist forgets how late it's become when she writes her name and number on a napkin and passes it to the boy, who takes it and keeps it as if it's the most valuable thing in his life. She promises the boy a second date and gets up to leave. After paying for the milkshake, she heads back home when she hears her roommate with another college student mate having a disturbingly loud session, making it difficult to conduct any tasks, let alone sleep. She gets to her room and lets out a big sigh, which makes her roommate and her partner stop making noises. She slowly drifts into sleep, thinking about the flattering boy she had a date with earlier. As she falls asleep, a dark shadow appears behind her window, staring inside, which ends the day. Back in the park, answering in shock that she doesn't have a boyfriend and doesn't even know the boy, he explains that he's been getting mixed messages from the protagonist, as it doesn't make much sense for her to come to this part of the park and not want the boy. Creeped out to the assumptions and claims, the protagonist quickly gets up from the bench, with the stranger quickly asking where she's going, to which she answers that she needs to go home, lying, just to get out of this strange situation, getting as far away from this deluded stranger as possible. The boy insists on walking the protagonist home when she calls him creepy, to which he insists that he loves her, when the protagonist has enough and walks away as quick as possible. Being paranoid and worried, trying to justify her reaction, she comes to the conclusion that she wasn't just paranoid and rude, but making such claims and presumptions without knowing someone is not psychologically healthy. On her way back home, she stops at a local florist to pick up some flowers to decorate her apartment. Being busy browsing through the shop, deep in analyzing the different types of flowers, the stranger from the park then suddenly appears next to her, making small talk. Startled by his presence, she accuses him of following him, which visibly hurts the boy, explaining that he always comes here. He further explains that he usually walks by the diner the protagonist works in, where he saw glimpses of her, but never got the courage to approach her. Rightfully, the protagonist freaks out, believing he's been stalking her, when she shouts at him. The stranger tries to comfort her, but she rushes out, being creeped out by him. Back in her apartment, the loud sounds are still heard from her roommate's room, when the protagonist goes straight to her bed, falling asleep, while the dark shadow still appears behind her window. A different route is when the protagonist acts grumpy and demeaning, calling the stranger pathetic and treating him like a loser and refusing his flowers. Nonetheless, she takes his number and plans to see him again. This leads to the same ending, with a strange character standing outside of the protagonist's room. After naming the stranger Peter, he shivers in surprise to how she knew his real name, which he hates very much, despite it being a typical name. Peter asks if the protagonist was talking to the girlfriend and if she told her his real name. In confusion, the protagonist insists on calling him Peter, reassuring him it's not a bad name and he should be happy about it. In the park, the boy mentions that he's the boyfriend of the protagonist, despite never speaking to each other before. This is confirmed that it's their first time speaking throughout the game, with Peter mentioning that he always wanted to approach the protagonist after gazing at her from outside of the diner, but never was able to. He further explains that he thought the protagonist had the same intentions and wanted him to become her boyfriend when she went to the secluded part of the park. Yet confirming what Peter meant by saying that he's the protagonist's boyfriend is that he actually wished it to happen, or due to his lack of social skills, he presumed because the protagonist went to that particular part of the park, they magically became partners, explaining that he misunderstood the protagonist's intentions. Despite his shy and timid demeanor, depicting he might be cute or innocent, his insistence and lack of understanding his counterpart's wishes to have personal space might suggest that it's only a temporary persona that he's adopting. Peter expresses sinister characteristics such as possessiveness, delusion, obsession, and stalking. As he seems to stalk the protagonist, presumes that they're in a relationship, invading her personal space, and making physical contact, and even worse, watching her from outside her work and following her in the secluded part of the park. It might be that he visits that part often on his own, but approaching someone and getting too close to them, not picking up social cues, is a bad sign. He also refused to give out his name, mentioning he doesn't like it while it's an absolutely typical name, not explaining why he doesn't like it. There might be things that he hides. Things become stranger when he mentions if the girlfriend told her that it's his real name, which he guesses randomly when prompted by him to name him whatever the protagonist wants. If Peter is not a delusional strange boy, he might be an imaginary figure inside the protagonist's mind. He was able to go out to the florist shop ahead of the protagonist, despite being left behind in the park. He was also constantly nice, as if his existence depended on pleasing and flattering the protagonist. He didn't even explain why he was so interested in the protagonist, acting as if he already knew her, moving in quickly, already getting too close to the protagonist. It's strange how the protagonist could also guess his name, and why she had the choice to choose his name in the first place, as if she could shape her own ideal boyfriend. The mention of girlfriend possibly is another form of flattery for the protagonist to believe Peter chose her over the girlfriend, to create some sort of drama. Peter seems like an overly attached boyfriend who already thinks they're in a relationship, skipping all the first steps and stages of getting to even know each other. The protagonist seemingly created her own ideal boyfriend in her mind to overcome the immense, unbearable stress of having to work non-stop, dealing with a horrible roommate, and barely making the ends meet. The shadow figure at the end is quite possibly the overly attached Peter, who's always there and relentlessly follows the protagonist in order to comfort and flatter her. This could be a real person who crosses the line after this final action, stalking the protagonist at night and possibly breaking into her room. But also, he could be a figment of her imagination, trying to ease her mind of all of her struggles. Let me know what your theories are down in the comments. I'd probably make more videos on the game when more episodes are released, because it seems very promising. Either way, it's been your host Star. Thanks yet again for being here. It's been nice having you, and I'll see you next time.